My friends, I want to begin today with an honest confession about a version of myself I am not particularly proud of, a version that persisted well into my 60s despite my genuine desire, throughout my entire life, to be a person of genuine character and self-respect. I noticed, during a particularly difficult stretch following my retirement, that I had begun to feel a persistent, low-grade discomfort with myself, an unease I could not immediately trace to any single event or circumstance. My health was reasonably good. My family relationships were, on the surface, functioning well enough. And yet I carried this quiet discomfort with my own character that I genuinely could not explain for the better part of a year. It was only through a slow, honest process of self-examination, prompted initially by a conversation with an old friend who gently observed that I seemed to apologize constantly for things requiring no apology at all, that I began identifying a pattern of small, seemingly insignificant behaviors that I had practiced for decades without ever recognizing their cumulative cost to my own sense of self-respect. None of these behaviors, examined individually, seemed particularly damaging or dramatic. Each one, in isolation, appeared almost too minor to warrant serious attention. But practiced consistently, day after day, decade after decade, I came to understand that these small behaviors had quietly eroded my own regard for myself far more thoroughly than any single significant failure or public embarrassment ever could have. I want to share with you today the 7 specific behaviors I identified during this period of honest self-examination. Behaviors that I believe quietly undermine self-respect in nearly anyone who practices them consistently, regardless of how minor or reasonable each individual instance might appear on the surface. This is not a lesson about becoming defensive, combative, or unnecessarily rigid in your dealings with others. It is a lesson about recognizing a set of small, habitual patterns that, left unexamined, gradually convince us, through the accumulated weight of thousands of small instances, that our own genuine needs, boundaries, and dignity matter considerably less than they actually do. The first behavior, apologizing for things that require no apology at all. I want to begin with the very behavior my old friend first pointed out to me, a habit of apologizing so reflexively and so constantly that the apology itself had become almost entirely disconnected from any genuine wrongdoing requiring it. I apologized when someone else bumped into me in a crowded store. I apologized for asking a reasonable question during a meeting. I apologized for having an opinion that differed from someone else's, even when I had done nothing whatsoever wrong in holding or expressing it. Once my friend pointed this pattern out directly, I began noticing it throughout an ordinary day with genuine alarm, discovering that I apologized, on average, dozens of times daily for circumstances that involved no actual fault on my part whatsoever. I came to understand that this constant, reflexive apologizing communicated something corrosive to my own sense of self over time, an implicit, repeated message that my very presence, my needs, and my ordinary participation in daily life required some kind of ongoing justification or forgiveness. Each individual apology seemed harmless enough in isolation, a small, polite verbal habit rather than any genuine admission of fault. But repeated dozens of times daily across many decades, this habit had quietly trained my own mind to treat my ordinary existence as something mildly inconvenient to others, requiring constant, low-grade contrition simply to occupy space in the world. Breaking this particular habit required considerable, deliberate practice, pausing before each reflexive apology to honestly ask myself whether genuine wrongdoing had actually occurred, and substituting a neutral, non-apologetic statement whenever the answer was no. Rather than apologizing for asking a question, I began simply asking the question. Rather than apologizing for someone else bumping into me, I began simply continuing on my way without comment. This small shift, practiced consistently over many months, gradually restored a sense that my ordinary presence and participation in daily life required no constant, implicit apology, a shift that measurably improved my own quiet sense of dignity in ways I had not anticipated from something so seemingly minor. I found it useful, once I began this practice, to keep a rough mental tally for a single ordinary day, simply noticing each time the reflexive urge to apologize arose without any genuine fault attached to it. The number I counted by the end of that single day startled me considerably, well over 24 instances in which I had nearly apologized for something requiring no apology whatsoever, a tally that made the cumulative scale of this habit, previously invisible to me, suddenly and vividly concrete. The second behavior, staying silent when something genuinely matters to you. The second behavior I identified was a persistent habit of remaining silent about genuine preferences, opinions, and needs whenever voicing them risked even mild disagreement or inconvenience to someone else, a habit I had practiced so consistently across my entire adult life that I had genuinely lost touch, in certain areas, with what my own authentic preferences actually were. I recalled countless family decisions, restaurant choices, vacation plans, and household matters where I had simply deferred entirely to whatever preference someone else expressed first, regardless of my own genuine feelings about the matter, believing this deference represented admirable flexibility and generosity of spirit. Examining this pattern honestly, I recognized that consistently silencing my own genuine preferences across thousands of small decisions over many decades had communicated to myself, repeatedly and cumulatively, that my own preferences simply did not carry sufficient weight to justify voicing them. This silent self-erasure, practiced so habitually that I rarely even noticed it occurring in the moment, had gradually convinced me, at some deep and largely unconscious level, that my own genuine wants were less legitimate or important than everyone else's, a belief that no single dramatic event had ever explicitly taught me, but that thousands of small, silent deferrals had quietly instilled nonetheless. Breaking this particular pattern required deliberately practicing the simple, uncomfortable act of voicing a genuine preference even in low-stakes situations where deference would have once been my automatic, unconsidered default. I began, somewhat awkwardly at first, stating my actual restaurant preference rather than immediately deferring to whoever spoke first, voicing my genuine opinion during family discussions rather than remaining reflexively silent. This practice, uncomfortable in its early stages, gradually restored a sense that my own preferences and voice genuinely mattered, a restoration that considerably improved my own self-respect in ways that went well beyond the specific restaurant choices or family decisions where I first began practicing this small, deliberate change. I recall, with some amusement now, how genuinely difficult it felt in the earliest weeks of this practice simply to state a restaurant preference aloud without immediately softening it with a qualifier suggesting I did not actually mind either way. My wife, noticing this new habit, gently teased me about it at first, though she also told me, quite sincerely, that she genuinely appreciated finally knowing what I actually wanted rather than continuing to guess at preferences I had spent decades concealing behind a practiced, automatic deference that had never actually reflected genuine indifference on my part. The third behavior, accepting treatment you would never accept on behalf of someone you love. The third behavior I identified was a pattern of tolerating treatment from certain people in my life that I would have found genuinely unacceptable had I witnessed the exact same treatment directed toward my own children or a close friend. I recalled numerous instances across many years where a particular relative spoke to me dismissively or critically in ways I would have immediately and firmly addressed had I witnessed this same relative speaking this way to someone I loved deeply, yet I consistently absorbed this treatment silently when it was directed toward myself, applying an entirely different, considerably more permissive standard to my own treatment than I would ever have accepted on behalf of anyone else I cared about. Examining this double standard honestly revealed something troubling about how I had unconsciously come to value my own dignity relative to the dignity of the people I loved. I recognized that I would defend a friend's right to respectful treatment without a moment's hesitation, yet I had spent decades quietly accepting disrespectful treatment directed at myself, as though my own dignity simply mattered less than theirs, a belief I had never consciously chosen but that my own consistent behavior had nonetheless clearly revealed. Breaking this particular pattern required a deliberate practice of applying the exact same standard to my own treatment that I would automatically apply on behalf of someone I loved, asking myself directly, in moments of disrespectful treatment, whether I would tolerate this exact same behavior directed at my own child or closest friend. When the honest answer was no, I began addressing the treatment directly rather than continuing to silently absorb it, a practice that gradually closed the troubling gap between how fiercely I protected the dignity of the people I loved and how casually I had once dismissed my own. I found this particular reframing, imagining the exact treatment directed instead at someone I loved, remarkably effective at cutting through decades of habitual self-minimization in a way that direct reflection on my own feelings alone had never quite managed to achieve. Something about picturing my own daughter receiving the same dismissive comment I had just quietly absorbed produced an immediate, visceral clarity about the genuine unacceptability of the treatment, a clarity my own self-directed feelings had somehow never managed to summon quite so sharply on their own. The fourth behavior, speaking about yourself in habitually self-deprecating terms. The fourth behavior I identified was a habit of speaking about myself, particularly in social settings, using consistently self-deprecating language, dismissing my own accomplishments, minimizing my own contributions, and generally presenting myself in a diminished light, a habit I had always believed reflected admirable humility, rather than anything genuinely corrosive to my own sense of self. I recalled countless conversations where I had reflexively dismissed a genuine accomplishment with a self-deprecating joke, or minimized a genuine contribution I had made to some family or community effort, believing this deflection made me appear more likable and less boastful to the people around me. Examining this pattern honestly, I recognized that habitually speaking about myself in diminished terms, even when intended purely as social humility, functioned as its own repeated, cumulative message to my own subconscious mind, one that gradually reinforced an internal narrative of genuine inadequacy rather than merely projecting external modesty to others. The words I spoke about myself, repeated thousands of times across many decades, had apparently been absorbed by my own mind considerably more literally than I had ever intended them, regardless of my genuine motivation for using them in the first place. Breaking this particular pattern required learning to acknowledge genuine accomplishments and contributions plainly and simply, without the reflexive self-deprecating qualifier I had habitually attached to nearly everything positive I had ever said about myself. This did not require becoming boastful or arrogant, simply honest, accepting a genuine compliment with a simple thank you rather than an immediate, automatic dismissal, and describing my own genuine contributions accurately rather than habitually minimizing them for the sake of appearing appropriately modest to whoever happened to be listening. I noticed something particularly interesting once I began this practice more consistently. The fifth behavior, breaking small promises you make only to yourself. The fifth behavior I identified was a persistent pattern of breaking small commitments I made only to myself, promises regarding my own exercise, my own creative pursuits, my own personal goals, commitments that carried no external accountability whatsoever, and that I therefore treated as considerably more negotiable and dispensable than any promise I would have made to another person. I recalled countless mornings across many years when I had told myself I would begin a particular healthy habit or personal project, only to abandon this private commitment at the first sign of minor inconvenience or simple laziness, a pattern I had never taken particularly seriously precisely because no other person was genuinely watching or holding me accountable to it. Examining this pattern honestly, I recognized that consistently breaking promises made only to myself had quietly taught my own mind, over many decades, that my own word to myself simply did not carry the same weight or seriousness as my word to anyone else. This particular erosion proved considerably more corrosive to my genuine self-respect than I had ever previously appreciated, since a person's fundamental trust in their own word, I came to understand, forms an essential foundation of genuine self-respect that external accomplishments and social reputation alone can never fully replace. Breaking this particular pattern required treating private commitments to myself with genuinely the same seriousness I would extend to any commitment made to another person, deliberately choosing smaller, more sustainable private commitments that I could genuinely honor consistently, rather than continuing my old pattern of making ambitious promises to myself that I predictably abandoned within days. This shift, beginning with genuinely modest, sustainable commitments rather than grand, quickly abandoned ones, gradually restored a genuine trust in my own word that decades of broken private promises had considerably eroded. I found it particularly helpful to treat a commitment made only to myself with the same practical seriousness I would apply to a scheduled appointment with another person, writing it down, protecting the specific time it required, and genuinely showing up for it, rather than allowing it to remain a vague, easily dismissed intention floating somewhere in the back of my mind. This small shift in practical treatment, simple as it sounds, made an enormous difference in how consistently I actually honored these private commitments once I began treating them with genuine, concrete seriousness rather than the casual, easily broken status I had unconsciously assigned them for so many decades. The sixth behavior, remaining in situations that consistently require you to abandon your own values. The sixth behavior I identified was a pattern of remaining, across considerable stretches of my life, in social and professional situations that consistently required me to act against my own genuine values in order to maintain smooth relations or avoid conflict, a pattern I justified for years as simply the reasonable compromise required by adult life and professional obligation. I recalled a particular professional environment, maintained for several years well into my 50s, where remaining in good standing regularly required participating, at least through my silence, in decisions and practices that privately troubled my own sense of ethics considerably. Examining this pattern honestly, I recognized that remaining, year after year, in an environment that regularly required abandoning my own genuine values had communicated something deeply corrosive to my own sense of self-respect, an implicit message that professional convenience and social smoothness mattered more to me than my own genuine integrity. This recognition arrived with considerable discomfort, forcing me to acknowledge that years of quiet compromise, however professionally convenient at the time, had likely cost me considerably more in terms of genuine self-respect than whatever professional stability this ongoing compromise had actually secured for me. Addressing this particular pattern eventually required making several difficult decisions, including an eventual departure from this particular professional environment, once the ongoing compromise required to remain within it had become genuinely unbearable to my own conscience. I want to be honest that this decision carried real professional and financial cost, a cost I do not want to minimize or suggest was easily absorbed. But I came to believe, looking back honestly, that remaining indefinitely in an environment requiring consistent abandonment of my own genuine values would have cost me considerably more in terms of the self-respect I have since come to value as one of the most essential foundations of a genuinely peaceful later life. I want to acknowledge, too, that not every situation requiring this kind of examination will demand as dramatic a resolution as a full professional departure. In several smaller instances across my own life, simply naming a values conflict honestly to the people involved, or declining a specific request that crossed a genuine ethical line for me, proved sufficient without requiring the wholesale departure I ultimately chose in my particular professional circumstance. What mattered most, in every instance, was the honest recognition itself, followed by whatever concrete action, large or small, genuinely restored alignment between my daily conduct and my own stated values. The seventh behavior, Comparing your own worth to others in a way that habitually diminishes yourself. The seventh and final behavior I identified was a persistent habit of comparing myself to others in a manner that consistently and specifically diminished my own sense of worth, a habit distinct from ordinary, occasional comparison in that it operated almost as a constant, low-grade internal narrative running throughout most of my daily thoughts across many decades. I recognized that I rarely, if ever, compared myself to others in ways that left me feeling genuinely equal or superior in any respect, instead consistently selecting comparisons calibrated specifically to leave myself feeling diminished by whatever particular standard happened to be under consideration at the time. Examining this pattern honestly, I recognized that this consistently self-diminishing comparative habit functioned almost as a form of chronic, low-grade self-punishment, repeated thousands of times across many decades, gradually convincing my own mind that I genuinely deserved to feel perpetually inadequate relative to nearly everyone around me, regardless of how objectively unreasonable or unbalanced any particular comparison actually was upon closer examination. Breaking this particular pattern required developing a considerably more honest, balanced approach to comparison, deliberately noticing and naming the many respects in which my own life and character genuinely compared favorably to others, rather than continuing my old habit of exclusively selecting comparisons calibrated to diminish myself. This did not require becoming arrogant or dismissive of others' genuine accomplishments, simply developing a considerably more balanced, honest internal accounting that no longer functioned as a consistent, one-sided instrument of self-diminishment across nearly every comparison I happened to make throughout an ordinary day. I found it helpful, whenever I noticed a self-diminishing comparison forming, to deliberately pause and identify at least one genuine respect in which my own circumstances compared favorably to the very same person I had just been comparing myself unfavorably against, not to replace one imbalanced comparison with an equally imbalanced opposite, but simply to restore some genuine honesty and proportion to an internal accounting that had, for decades, been quietly rigged entirely against my own favor. My friends, I want to be honest with you that recognizing and beginning to address these 7 behaviors did not happen quickly, and I want to be equally honest that I still occasionally catch myself slipping back into one or another of these old patterns, particularly during stressful periods when these decades-old habits feel considerably easier to fall back into than the more deliberate practices I have since developed. What has changed is not that these old impulses have disappeared entirely, but that I now recognize them clearly the moment they arise, possessing, through considerable practice, a genuine choice about whether to follow them or respond differently, a choice that simply did not exist for me during the many decades when these patterns operated almost entirely below the level of my conscious awareness. I think often of that conversation with my old friend, the simple, gentle observation about my constant, reflexive apologizing that first opened my eyes to a pattern I had genuinely never noticed despite having practiced it, quite literally, tens of thousands of times across my entire adult life. I am considerably grateful for his willingness to name this pattern directly, rather than simply accepting it as an unremarkable feature of my personality, and I hope, in sharing these 7 behaviors with you today, that I might offer you a similar, honest mirror, one that reveals patterns you may have practiced for just as long without ever fully recognizing their genuine cost to your own sense of self-respect. If you are watching this today and you recognize, in your own life, even one of these 7 behaviors quietly eroding your own self-respect across many years, I want you to know that these patterns, however deeply ingrained through decades of consistent practice, are genuinely capable of being unlearned at any age, through the same patient, repeated practice that originally installed them. Self-respect, I have come to believe, is not a fixed trait you either possess or lack. It is a cumulative result of thousands of small, daily choices that remain genuinely available to be made differently starting today, regardless of how consistently you may have made them one particular way for however many decades have already passed. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared helps you recognize your own particular version of these 7 behaviors, and gives you the courage to begin, patiently and deliberately, choosing differently. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Guard your own dignity the way you would guard the dignity of anyone you love deeply. And trust that it is genuinely never too late to begin rebuilding a self-respect that decades of small, quiet erosion may have worn considerably thinner than you ever fully realized. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay honest, stay dignified, and remember, self-respect is rarely destroyed in a single dramatic moment. It is worn away, quietly, one small daily choice at a time, and it can be rebuilt in exactly the same patient, quiet manner. Thank you for watching.